Hi everyone, this is Christina Wallace and welcome back to the first term of Human Anatomy and Physiology Lab at Clackamas Community College. Today we're going to be talking about the brain and cranial nerves and the spinal cord, and those are exercises 17 and 19. So before I get into your lab report or your lab instructions, I just want to give a brief tour of what we're going to be covering today. So here is a sagittal cross-section of your brain and your brain stem and your spinal cord. And so your spinal cord starts down here. Oh, sorry. I want to put my pen on. Spinal cord is down here, right? All of that stuff is spinal cord. And then your brain stem is pretty much kind of all of this stuff in here that I just outlined in the pinky purple color. That's brainstem. And then your cerebrum is all of the part up here that pretty much is what we think of when we think of the weird wiggly parts of our brain. And then your cerebellum, so the blue is cerebrum. And then let's see, how about yellow? And then yellow, this stuff over here, this lower portion in the posterior side, that is your cerebellum. So cerebrum here, and then your brain stem, this is all brain stem stuff. And then your cerebellum is here. And so we're going to start with the spinal cord, actually, which is down here. So we're going to talk all about spinal cord architecture, and then a cross-section histology of the spinal cord. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the nerves kind of come off of your spinal cord and are formed. And that's all exercise 19. And then after that, we're going to go talk about your brain stem and your brain, and that's exercise 17. So let's come here to your lab report. This is your where we start on the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and autonomic nervous system. This is pages 302 to 312 in your lab manual. It's a pretty short chapter. And so it covers a little bit about architecture, so we will talk about architecture. A little bit about kind of what the architecture of the spinal cord, and then a little bit about lumbar taps. And then the next page goes on to talk about a cross-section of the spinal cord. You can see a picture of that on 304, and then we will look at the pictures that the instructions send you to as well. So here we are at the lab instructions for this week's lab, brain and spinal cord. And so the first thing that it points you to is a close-up of the spinal cord labeled. So this is going to be like slide 1, right? And then there will be a picture of a dorsal root ganglia, which was also in the video from our previous nervous tissue lab report. So you'll be able to see that as well. So there's a slide here, that's number 2. And then there's another closer view of the dorsal root ganglia, so that's like right here. And then there's also a picture from Histology Guide, which is the one that I included in the nervous tissue chapter. So spinal cord is first, then we're going to see a dorsal root ganglia, and then we're going to see a couple other views of dorsal root ganglia. So let's start at the spinal cord. And so here on the right-hand side of your picture is this kind of a map of the spinal cord. And so we learned those regions when we learned the vertebral column, right? The cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, the sacral region. And so now we're just going to look at the actual tissue of the nervous system that runs down that vertebral canal. And there's 3 pieces of architecture on the spinal cord that you have to understand. So your spinal cord stretches all the way from your brain stem So your brain stem up here, right? Up in your brain. And goes through your cervical vertebrae, your thoracic vertebrae. And then it ends kind of, you can see where it ends, like right about this level. And so it doesn't stretch all the way down. Your spinal cord proper doesn't stretch all the way down into your sacrum. It stops in kind of a cone shape. And so that's what I've highlighted. That's one of the 3 terms on the spinal column that you have to know, is conus medullaris. And so that is analogous to this piece of the spinal cord that I've drawn on the horse butt, because cauda equina means horse, and the caudal end of anything, remember we learned from our anatomical terms, is like the tail end. And so cauda equina is named for horse's tail. And so this is the very tip of the spinal cord. And so conus medullaris happens like right about here. That's the end of the spinal cord proper. And then you have the horse tail part, which I've highlighted in yellow here. So all of this stuff coming off, those are little root fibers that are going to come out, and they're going to kind of go out and form spinal nerves. And then they're going to come into your sacrum and form plexuses and braids with other nerve tissues, and then they'll go down your leg and around your front of your leg and around your back and stuff and form spinal nerves. And so all those little kind of roots coming off is the cauda equina. And then the filium terminale is this funky little dense connective tissue tendon that kind of anchors the spinal cord down to the sacrum. And so it makes it so your spinal cord won't bounce up into your vertebral column. It's kind of an anchor. So filium terminale is the anchor line that holds the spinal cord in. And so you can see that on the next picture, on the cadaver picture. You can see the conus medullaris right here, and you can see all the cauda equina coming off on the sides, and you can see the filium terminale going down like that. So that's the spinal cord architecture that you need to know. So the very next thing that your lab report asks about is the cross section of the spinal cord. And so here I have given you both a diagram on the left to kind of remind yourself of where things are, and then the actual labeled cross-section, which is the first slide from your online instructions. And it goes over all of those pieces of architecture inside of your spinal cord. And so I'm just going to do a quick little review here. So on the outside, here's your spinal cord proper, right? We're looking at our spinal cord right over here. There is white matter kind of on the outside, and then the little butterfly on the inside is gray matter. So I just outlined all the gray matter in green right here. That's gray matter. So this stuff right here is the gray matter. And it's kind of like a butterfly shape. Gray matter. And then your white matter is all of this stuff right out here. White matter. And it's white because of what? Myelin. So axons are going to live more out here. And cell bodies are going to live more in the gray matter. Axons on the outside, cell bodies in the gray matter. And so then there's pieces of architecture. Let's try to kind of connect. The gray matter has horns, and so you're going to have a posterior gray horn up here and a lateral gray horn on some parts of your spinal cord over here on the lateral side, and then an anterior gray horn on the anterior side. Of our spinal cord. So those are all the pieces of architecture: posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn of gray matter. The same thing, anterior is the same as ventral. So this is, while it says anterior gray horn right here, you can also call this ventral gray horn. And you can call this a dorsal gray horn over there. So remember, anterior means ventral, posterior means dorsal. So the dorsal root ganglion, remember, occurs kind of out here. We can see one right here, this little bump that's on the back on the posterior nerve root. Those are the dorsal horns, and we'll see those in a histology picture in just a minute. There is a fissure and a sulcus. So on the anterior median fissure right here, there is kind of a split, kind of an opening right here. It's bigger in the front, so it's a fissure in the front. And in the back, it's just a sulcus, and so it's much thinner. So I'll put a little dashed line. But there is kind of a little split, and you can see them right here. There's the little posterior one, and then here is the bigger anterior fissure right there. Anterior and posterior fissures. Or no, anterior fissure and posterior sulcus. Central canal's in the middle. We've seen central canal before. There we go. Remember, there's some cells in there that you have to know that line. Spinal nerves are what's coming off out here. So you have branches that are kind of arriving at the back of your spine, and then you have branches that kind of exit from the front of your spine, and once they join together, that's a spinal nerve. So right here, that's a spinal nerve, that's a spinal nerve. Once we get like branches coming off, we get a new name. So, but we're going to have one-way traffic kind of on the roots, and then out here we're going to get two-way traffic, and I have a better picture of that. So just think about the a ramus is a branch, so rami are going to be these branches coming off of the nerves way out here. Those are rami. And then we're going to have ganglion, and we're going to have roots. So I just want to flash back for a second to the previous nervous tissue lab where they introduced the idea of a sensory or afferent neuron and a motor or efferent neuron. And I just wanted to kind of show you that there's a nice little mnemonic to remember those things, and it's called Same Dave. It's this guy right here, Same Dave. And so a sensory neuron is the same as an afferent neuron, and a motor neuron is the same as an efferent neuron. And so that means that any thing coming in the posterior side or dorsal side is going to be afferent. All afferent things are sensory things. And so that means every sensory signal coming from your body is going to arrive at your spinal cord from the back. Actually, wouldn't that be nicer if I did it in blue? There, because I already put blue. So afferent is arriving signals, and efferent are motor signals. So the motor signals exit from the front, and they go tell your body what to do. So you touch a hot stove, and an afferent signal like comes in, ow, it's hot. And then to get your hand to pull away from the stove, a signal goes out this direction, and it tells your muscles to pull your hand away from the stove. So all arriving signals, everything that goes through your dorsal root ganglion is going to be an arriving sensory bit of information. That's why we have a ganglion there, because it's a sensory nerve. This little guy right here, remember the cell bodies, the little lollipop where the cell body lives, and then it goes down to an axon, and the axons are below? Sensory. Then everything that exits from the front is a motor command. So those are going to be motor fibers in the front. And then right out here where you see the spinal nerve right here, you get a two-way highway. So while we're connecting to the spinal cord, we have a one-way highway going in the back, sensory information, and a one-way highway going exiting the front, motor commands, and then they join together and we get two-way highways in our peripheral nerves most of the time. We have arriving information and exiting motor commands kind of using fibers that are next to each other. So I just kind of wanted to remind you of sensory and motor signals and what that meant. Here's a picture of some dorsal root ganglion. And so in the lower picture, I think this is the second link from your online instructions. There is a dorsal root ganglion out here. And then you can see the whole spinal cord over here. So here is the gray matter, right? And the white matter out here, white matter. And then so there's a dorsal root ganglion here that is magnified and labeled for you. So your cell bodies are all the little circular things. And then the axons are the fibers kind of running through. Same thing up at the top. Here are the axon fibers. This is the histology guide picture. And then the cell bodies are all the circular things. And so this is how the sensory information, remember, sensory information is coming into our spinal cord through that dorsal root ganglion. It's coming in like this and talking to the posterior horn. So we have talked through a little bit. You have lots of pictures of the cross-section architecture of the spinal cord. I also want to draw your attention to what I've highlighted at the bottom of this picture. There is a video of a human model of the spinal cord. So let's go take a look at that. So back to the online instructions for exercise 17 and 19. Right here, there is a video for the model. And so that's literally going to take you through a hands-on plastic model of the spinal cord and kind of walk you through the architecture. And so it might be good to watch this video before you even do your lab. Like watch the video of them walking you through the spinal cord architecture. You know, it doesn't matter. You can watch the video for the sheep brain dissection too before you fill out stuff if it helps you to kind of get your bearings. But know this model because you will be asked questions on the spinal cord model. All right, so under the spinal cord cross-section image, there are some questions. Should be pretty review. So, you know, remember about the cells that line the central canal of your spinal cord. And then there's some questions about different types of neurons that you're going to see in different places where you have to kind of identify structure and function of neurons. This is the dorsal root ganglion that we just spent a bunch of time looking at. There's a cool cadaver picture if in your lab book if you want to check it out in your lab manual. And then there are some questions about different plexuses. And so a plexus is a web or a net or a braid. And so remember those cauda equina fibers that came off the dorsal or the distal end of your spinal cord? Those kind of join together in different combinations and form peripheral nerves that go down your legs and stuff and out of your arms because your cervical spine also has fibers that come off and make spinal nerves. So you have a cervical plexus, you have a brachial plexus that services your arm. Your arm is one of the, you know, the more advanced pieces of equipment on a modern evolved human. And so there's lots of nerves that feed all of that fantastic activity that your arms are able to do. So they have their whole own plexus. So fibers coming off, forming different ropes together, braiding together, and creating new nerves. And so don't overlook your lecture notes. So any place where I have written an LN, lecture notes, check those. And so this was the peripheral and central nervous system lecture notes. You can find some information about plexuses there. And so you have a cervical, a brachial, and then there are some branches of the brachial plexus listed here. You should know what area of the arm or body that each of these nerves is feeding. So your radial nerve is going to service a different area than your ulnar nerve. And so know where these are going roughly and kind of what muscles they're servicing. Then you have a lumbar plexus. From your lumbar plexus, your femoral nerve arises. Your femoral nerve goes down your femur. It's in the front. Front femoral, front femoral. Your sacral plexus gives rise to your sciatic nerve. Think of those sciatic notches on your pelvis, and that goes down the back of your leg. So if you just remember, femoral front goes with lumbar, and then your sacral plexus goes with the sciatic nerve, and that goes down the back of your leg and services your lower leg calf muscles and stuff. All right, and so then we're going to move on to the brain. And so now we're going into exercise 17, the brain and cranial nerves. So we start off with kind of looking at the brain stem. And so your brain stem starts out with these kind of big walnutty looking lobes of your thalamus that come together in the middle, right? There's going to be a little space in the middle between these two walnut halves that's actually open. So it's like a walnut half coming together and a walnut half coming together, and then there's going to be a little liquid-filled space kind of in between. So that's your thalamus. And then your brainstem kind of extends down from there. So all of this is brainstem. And so I say know this architecture because figuring out, looking at a picture, what the cranial nerves are, it can help you. Is it between like your thalamus and your pons, or is it between your pons and your medulla oblongata? And so kind of understanding these major areas of architecture will help you in finding cranial nerves. That's why I say know this location. And your textbook has a great labeled pictures. This particular picture is not in your lab manual, so I would go to your textbook. It is also in my study guide. So just a couple of things. I've labeled a couple of things on here that I think are kind of funky. So you'll see this word peduncles. It's kind of like these ribbons of tissue that are going to go connect up to the worm-like cerebrum that would be up here. Remember, there's a cerebrum up here. And so these cerebral peduncles are going to go connect to your cerebrum. We're also in the next picture going to see some cerebellar peduncles. And so just kind of think of them as like the ribbons of connecting nervous tissue. So let's go down to the next picture. So this is a picture of the posterior aspect of your brainstem, and we can see those cerebellar peduncles. And so this is this tissue that would have gone out to those lobes of the cerebellum that were out here. Remember, the cerebellum had all those little filia kind of lines on it like that. That's what cerebellar peduncles are, those little ribbons that would connect to the missing lobes that we can't see. And so again, in between, I've labeled a couple of things on here that I think most students have difficulty with. I've left you lots of blanks where you have to, where you have to find and label information. So all the nerves and stuff I have left for you to label. But this little tiny opening right between the parts of your thalamus is the third ventricle. And so remember I told you there was a little liquid-filled space kind of in between these two halves. That's third ventricle. And then right below it, right here, there is a gland. Remember the gland that comes out and sits in the sella turcica of your sphenoid bone? And so that's, oh no, pardon me, wrong gland. I'm looking at the back of your brainstem, not the front. So no, this is the gland that kind of handles your circadian rhythms and stuff. So there's a little tiny gland on the posterior aspect of your brainstem that looks like a nut. So I'll leave you to figure out what that little gland is that does your circadian rhythms. And then below that are these structures that form corpora quadrigemina. And you know, people just have trouble with that. So I've left you to determine the individual pieces of corpora quadrigemina. But what corpora quadrigemina means, corpora means body, right? And then quad is 4, And then Gemini, what's the sign of the Gemini? The twins. So the body of the 4 twins. And so on some level, you have 2 symmetrical structures, and they each have a substructure within them, right? So that's the body of the 4 twins. I want you to figure out what this one is and what that one is, okay? And then it's just kind of labeling out for you the pieces, parts of the back of your brainstem. So you have the midbrain, you have the pons in the very middle, and then you have medulla oblongata in the back. And a lot of people just kind of forget or don't see these brackets. So I filled that part in for you. And then I labeled the choroid plexus for you because that's this funky little capillary bed that we would find in ventricles that helps to make your cerebrospinal fluid. And so all the rest of the blanks on this page, I want you to label yourself. So all the nerves, all the blanks. Figure out that architecture. And so in this video and in my study guide slides, I have an older version of this picture, and it gives you a lateral view but not a posterior view, but I still think you should be able to get all the names of the structures from it just fine. And now as we move on into your brain lab report, you're just going to be looking at lots of different views of the brain and labeling things on them. And so here we're looking at an inferior view of the surface of the brain. And so you can see all of the cerebrum up here, right? And then down in here, it's like the walnut lobes of our thalamus are kind of buried, right? But then we can kind of see the brainstem down here. And so that's all similar architecture to what we just labeled in our pictures. And so you have the pons and you have the medulla oblongata right there, right? And so try to name the rest of the pieces of the architecture. And then there are just 2 cranial nerves that are labeled on this picture. And so I've shown you where they are. I want you to figure out what is cranial nerve 1 and cranial nerve 2. Then your lab moves on to a labeling a sagittal section of the brain. So this is just straight out of your lab book, just kind of poke around and try to figure out some of the structures. And I'm going to talk you through a couple of them and label in a different picture than this. All right, so let's just walk through a little bit of your architecture here. So you have a frontal lobe and a parietal lobe and an occipital lobe of your brain. Your cerebellum is out here. Within your cerebellum, there's this cool, funky white structure. That's arbor vitae, your tree of life. Vitae, sorry, A-E. Arbor vitae. Within your brainstem, you have a couple of ventricles, and so this right here is a fluid-filled space of your lateral ventricle. And then there's going to be a thin fluid-filled space kind of right in here. That is your third ventricle. And then you're going to have another fluid-filled space right here, the cerebral aqueduct. And then the fourth ventricle is the fluid-filled space that kind of points into the cerebellum right there. So lateral ventricle, then you have third ventricle, then you have cerebral aqueduct, then you have fourth ventricle, and then it'll go down your central canal of your spinal cord. Spinal cord, central canal. So that's all the liquid-filled spaces that we're going to see in the brain, okay? Right around the ceiling and the floor of your lateral ventricle. At least looking at it this way, it's kind of a good way to remember. Corpus callosum is the ceiling, so it's this kind of curved C-shaped structure. So it's like shaped like a big C, right? So that's easy to remember. Corpus callosum. And then the fornix is the floor right here. This little bit of tissue right there is fornix. So the fornix is the floor of your lateral ventricle, and then corpus callosum is the ceiling. Of your ventricle. And then within your ventricle, you have some of, this is the capillary bed of the choroid plexus, and we would see some of that up here too. And that's going to occur, see, we have another little capillary bed in your fourth ventricle. Those are helping to generate cerebrospinal fluid out of your blood plasma. Your blood plasma is the source of your cerebrospinal fluid. Then we have kind of all of these funky like knobs and stuff. We have to figure out what's going on down the brainstem. And so the first thing we're going to see in this cut is right here. And that is our optic chiasm. It's where our optic nerves are going to cross. And so you have your optic nerve come down like this, and it looks like a little pair of cow horns, and then it goes backwards into tracks like that. This space right here, where the nerve fibers cross, is called your optic chiasm. And when we look at it in cross-section like this, it's just going to be this little nubbin right there. Optic chiasm. Then the next thing we're going to see is the little stalk of your infundibulum that goes out to your pituitary gland, right? Oops, sorry, I don't know how to spell. Pituitary gland. There we go. So the infundibulum is the stalk, right, that goes out to hold your pituitary gland. So we have optic chiasm, infundibulum, and then your pituitary gland. We're going to hang down from there. And then we go back, and this little circle of stuff is going to be a mammillary body. And so just kind of get that order of stuff. It goes optic chiasm, and then it'll go infundibulum, and then heading kind of down the brainstem, it'll go mammillary body, and then it'll kind of curve down, and there'll be this big bump of your pons, and then your medulla oblongata down below that. So we have a bump, we have a stalk that goes out to a gland, then we have a bump of your mammillary body. Optic chiasm, infundibulum, mammillary body, pons, medulla oblongata. So that's kind of the front part of your brainstem. The posterior side of your brainstem, kind of coming off of your fornix or at the back of your thalamus. Ooh, we didn't talk about your thalamus. Let's talk about your thalamus first. This circle of stuff right here is your thalamus, and it has this little dot of an interthalamic adhesion. And so those are the two, this is the place where I just colored in blue. This is where the two walnut halves of your thalamus join together, and the tissue is continuous. And then all the place that I'm coloring here blue, there's a little thin area where water could live between the two halves. And so it's connected here, and actually I'll put black. It's connected right there, and then all of this stuff has a little sheen of water over it. That's your third ventricle. Remember, this is your lateral ventricle. Then your third ventricle is between the two halves of your thalamus. And then your fourth ventricle is down here, remember? All right, so your thalamus was right here, interthalamic adhesion. If that's your thalamus, then what is this area kind of below your thalamus? This is your hypothalamus. And that is what our pituitary gland arises from. So there is our pituitary gland, and it arises from the hypothalamus. So it goes down to pituitary gland. So thalamus, hypothalamus. At the back of our thalamus, we have the pineal gland. So this pineal gland deals with your circadian rhythms. And then below that, we have the body of the four twins, remember? So corpora quadrigemina is right there. And so it kind of divides in half. There's a superior and an inferior colliculus in that corpora quadrigemina structure. And then at the very back, you have cerebellum with arbor vitae inside. Arbor vitae is the white tree. And that's pretty much most of the brain architecture. I think you can find all the rest of the things yourself. I found this kind of picture labeled with dots or with letters. I thought it might be fun if you want to screenshot this picture and self-quiz yourself and email it to me. I'll grade it and send it back. Or just use it to study. I just thought it was kind of cool. The last part of your brain lab walks you through, or there's a video that you watch that has a sheep brain dissection, and then there is a biology corner series of steps that kind of walk you through the sheep brain dissection. And that, I have all of those pictures here in your study guide and in your video. And so I'm going to kind of just walk through the sheep brain dissection pictures now. I'm done covering everything else in the lab at this point. So we've kind of talked about the brain architecture. I will leave you to label stuff. Oh, we're going to talk about, I want to talk about one more thing actually before I come back to sheep brain dissection. Pardon. So here we are in your lab report again, and there's a link to your sheep brain dissection video, and then there's a nice step-by-step guide, and those are the pictures that I just alluded to that'll be in the study guide and in the video. I'm going to go over those, but you can watch the video here on your own time. I'm not going to show you the video. And I just acknowledge over here that I have those pictures from the biology corner. And then so here we just go through the vocabulary a little bit. So some of this vocabulary you can see on the diagram and on the video, the sheep video. Be prepared to see pictures from that biology corner guide on a test. Dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater are the meninges, or the layers of wrappings around your brain and spinal cord, and both your brain and spinal cord have all three layers. Dura mater literally is German for tough mother, and so it's the tough outer fibrous wrapping. Arachnoid matter, what does arachnoid make you think of? It's spiders, right? And so it's a spider-like clear membrane. So it's kind of like that weird thin little clear membrane you sometimes see on a chicken breast, but it has capillaries underneath of it. And so the capillaries end up looking kind of like little spider veins. And then pia mater is the delicate innermost layer that literally lays right on the brain and spinal cord and can't be lifted up or pinned because it's interwoven into the nervous tissue of your brain and spinal cord. Then there's a little bit, so we talk about all the structures here under dura mater. All of these structures A through F are made somehow of dura mater. And so you have a dural sinus, which is like two layers of dura mater that have a venous sinus underneath. So all of your venous blood from your brain gets drained into a dural sinus, and then it kind of exits through your jugular veins and stuff. Your pituitary gland is outside of your brain, and so it's kind of wrapped in the dura mater. Falx cerebri is like falx means kind of a separator, like a fibrous membrane that's separator. So falx cerebri separates the two halves of your cerebrum, the two halves of your brain. That's also where your sagittal dural sinus is. So that's happening in the longitudinal fissure between the two halves of your brain. And then falx cerebelli, that's a membrane, kind of a hard fibrous membrane that occurs between cerebrum and cerebellum. And then tentorium cerebelli is kind of like a cerebellar membrane. And so all of that has to do with kind of structures made of the dura mater, and none of those, it's really hard to test those on the sheep brain. So just kind of be aware, look at your lab book pictures for those. Then there's a little bit about cranial nerve 1 and cranial nerve 2, so we can see those on the sheep brain. Then 6, cerebrum, we can see here, there's a bunch of structures that occur on your cerebrum. So corpus callosum, that was the ceiling of the lateral ventricle. Fornix was the floor of the lateral ventricle. Septum pellucidum, what does septum make you think of? Like nasal septum. Septum is a divider, a separator of some sort. And so it's a membrane that kind of lives over the surface of your lateral ventricle that makes it separated from the one on the other side. So you have a left lateral ventricle and a right lateral ventricle, and there's a little membrane in between them called septum pellucidum. Lateral ventricles, those are the fluid-filled spaces in the upper, their most superior fluid-filled spaces. Choroid plexus is the capillaries that help make your CSF. Cerebral cortex, so there's gray matter and white matter in your brain and spinal cord. It's interesting, like in your spinal cord, the gray matter's in the middle and the white matter's on the outside. Well, once it gets up to your brain, your cerebral cortex, the thinking, intelligent part of your brain, is gray matter. So it's gray on the outside and white on the inside. Just kind of interesting. Then it will walk you through the cerebellum and structures on the cerebellum you have to know. So arbor vitae is that white tree of life. And then diencephalon is kind of another name for your midbrain. It's kind of like the top of your brainstem. So the two walnut halves of your thalamus with that little connector bridge of tissue, and then the thin third ventricle that would occur kind of between the two walnut halves of your thalamus. Interventricular foramen is the little opening between the two ventricles that sometimes you see. Hypothalamus, remember, that's the region below the thalamus. So thalamus is kind of circular, and hypothalamus is kind of a little rectangle that's leading out to your pituitary gland. Epithalamus is another name for your pineal gland that's in the posterior side of your thalamus. Then in your brainstem, so your brainstem in the midbrain area, that's on the back side, you'll see corpora quadrigemina. So that's the body of the four twins, remember? You'll see on the brainstem the oculomotor nerve, that's on the front of the brainstem. Cerebral aqueduct is, you'll see on a sagittal cut of the brain. Mammillary bodies is a bit of tissue. There'll be two little bumps on the human brain, so they look a little bit like little boobies. That's why it says mammillary. There's only one on the sheep brain, and so it's kind of a location thing, and I'll point that out when we see it on the sheep brain. And then pons and medulla oblongata are pieces of brain architecture, and then kind of some of the nerves and ventricles that are associated with that location. So this is kind of walking you down from the cerebrum down the brainstem from the proximal to the distal end of the brainstem. This is kind of the diagram of a sheep brain, and so I've labeled a couple of things from the list above that are hard to find, and so sometimes people have trouble identifying this funky little olfactory bulb. So that's olfactory nerve CN1. And then here is your a gland, and the bridge, the little stalk that goes out to the pituitary gland is infundibulum. A lot of people miss that one, that little line. And then here, location-wise, I just labeled the cerebral peduncle for you because some people get confused about what they're pointing at there. And then I also labeled the cerebral aqueduct. So that's a watery passage that connects the watery third ventricle to the watery fourth ventricle. Everything else should be pretty self-explanatory. And you can look at the pictures from the sheep brain dissection or the video from the sheep brain dissection before or after labeling this. Doesn't matter. Whatever works for your brain better. All right, and then after that in the lab, there's just some kind of pieces of architecture that they want you to define. So understanding the functions of these things. So choroid plexus, remember, was that capillary bed that makes your CSF. And so there's some other structures here. There are some cranial nerves here. Cranial nerve 1 through 6 are visible on the sheep brain, so I would know where they go and what they serve and if they are sensory, motor, or mixed. and then more vocabulary. And then the last page of your lab, I'll go back to the sheep brain dissection, but this last page of your lab is all about CSF flow. And so it tells you to understand the flow from the label, the numbers 1 through 4, and then to make sure you name all structures the fluid flows through. And so typically in my class, we would go over this on the board. And so I want to refer you to a couple of pages. So your lab manual has this picture that's in your lab report, but then your textbook does a better job of kind of explaining the flow. And you might want to look at the ventricle picture in your lab manual to kind of understand. And so here's the picture right here. And so we start with kind of number 1 in the middle at this choroid plexus that's going to send fluid into these spaces. And then there's a space and an opening and another space. And so that's what I've labeled A, B, C. Then we have another fluid-filled space right here. That's D. Then we have another fluid-filled space right here. That's E. Then we get to the number 2. And then you can see the number 3 is over here. The 3 is a space. And so I've labeled a couple other pieces of this space 3. So all of number 3s, anywhere you see a number 3 is the same thing. And it's a space. And then we're going to go through a structure at number 4 right here. These little funky cauliflower looking sticky uppy structures. Those are a structure that has to do with the arachnoid mater. And then those are going to empty fluid into a space. And that last space I've labeled F. And that is your dural sinus. And that's a blood-filled space. And so we're putting CSF back into your venous blood flow because it's made out of plasma, right? It's going to go straight back into plasma. And so I've kind of given you a list here in order. So I start with number 1 and I tell you, I kind of remind you that that little funky red thing is a capillary bed. Then you have a ventricle and an opening and a ventricle and a passageway and a ventricle, and then the numbers that are labeled, and then they finally go into the dural sinus. And that's what it means to say name all the structures the fluid flows through. So if you can kind of follow along here and follow along in the picture, try to identify, I've given you 1, so try to identify A, B, C, D, E, and then I've 2, 3, and 4 we've talked about, and then F is the dural sinus is the last place. So try to figure that out. Okay, so that's your lab proper, and now I'm going to spend a little time going over the sheep brain dissection, because it's really cool. So at first it kind of shows you the whole sheep brain with the dura mater on the outside. And so this is the superior aspect of the brain. Your cerebellum is over here. Your brain stem going out to your spinal cord is right there. And this is the inferior surface of your brain. So your frontal lobes. And then we're going to go down the brain stem to your pons and medulla oblongata kind of down there. So second picture, they kind of are cutting through the dura mater. And so you can see that tough mother. You can see how thick that dura mater membrane is. And you can see the pituitary gland right there is kind of embedded in this dura mater. Here you can see some, and everything is labeled up here. So it labels the pituitary gland for you. It labels the optic chiasma. Remember, that's where the optic nerves cross. And then the olfactory bulb, the olfactory nerves. So up here is your olfactory bulbs. Sheep have really great senses of smell, so they have really big olfactory bulbs. And then the optic nerves are here. So that's an optic nerve that goes out to an eyeball. That goes out to an eyeball. And then where they cross, remember, is the chiasma. Then behind that, going down the brain stem, you're going to have pituitary gland, and there's going to be some structures under there and some nerves that we have to know. So remember when you looked at it sagittally, you saw that optic chiasm, and then you saw the stalk of the infundibulum that comes out to this pituitary gland. Then we're going to see a mammillary body underneath of there, and we're going to see some cranial nerves on either side underneath of there. Then the pons, then the medulla oblongata, then the spinal cord. And they just go through and label all the pictures for you very nicely. And so now we've removed most of the dura mater, and you can see what's underneath of it. And so because we've removed the dura mater, we've also removed the pituitary gland on the outside, so we can see what's underneath of it. So you can still see the optic nerves here, and the optic chiasm, and the olfactory nerve here. Then behind that, you'll have a little kind of brown stalk of your infundibulum. Then you have this kind of upside down white gumdrop. That's a mammillary body right here. And on either side of that, you have these little tapeworm looking oculomotor nerves. They look flat like little tapeworms. And so that's all kind of happening in the midbrain. So remember that your pituitary gland and infundibulum is connected to your hypothalamus. And so this is kind of right where your hypothalamus would be if we went deep in. And so then we're going to have to learn a little bit of the nerves that kind of occur around the pons and then around the medulla oblongata. So they walk through the kind of the architecture and lobes of the brain. Then they show you a kind of a back posterior picture of the brain. So they're kind of looking up and they're looking at a gland right in there, and that would be the pineal gland right up in there. And then you're seeing two lumps, parts of the corpora quadrigemina. So you're able to see kind of the poofy top round superior colliculi right here. We can't really see the inferior colliculi because they're being hidden by the poker, by the probe. Now we finally get to a sagittal cut. And so they've just gone down the longitudinal fissure of the brain, and we're going to see we can see all the pieces of the inner architecture. And so you can kind of see the corpus callosum, and you can see that little space right there of the lateral ventricle. So over here, there's a probe in the lateral ventricle. And so a septum pellucidum would be a membrane that covers that space. So corpus callosum, fornix, thalamus, hypothalamus, right? Thalamus, hypothalamus, cerebellum, arbor vitae, etc. And so they'll just go through and kind of bring your attention to different pieces of vocabulary and kind of show you different fissures. So here's the transverse fissure. This is an interesting cut on the left here because they cut through the brain, but they don't cut through the cerebellum. And so you get to kind of see the inferior colliculi connected right there and the superior colliculi separated and the pin through the pineal gland. So that's just kind of a really interesting view of the posterior aspect of the brainstem right there. And so again, just great pictures. The pins up here in the top right are show the pineal gland, the thalamus, and the lateral ventricle, kind of in order. Pineal gland at the back posterior aspect of your thalamus, and then the space would be the lateral ventricle, and then a beautiful labeled picture for you. And so that's pretty much your lab. Happy studying to you. I'll see you next week.